Okay. So, so we're talking about decision analysis now, and we're specifically interested in making the decision under uncertainty or under a situation where you have multiple criteria to consider. Because if you only have one criteria, then the decision-making approach is somewhat simple. Once you evaluate the alternative, you just pick the one with the benefit cost ratio, or you apply that incremental benefit cost ratio approach that we learned before. So, evaluation of alternatives, if you have one criteria and no risks to consider, no uncertainty to consider, then evaluation of alternatives sort of is the decision analysis. The decision analysis step in that scenario becomes somewhat trivial. But I showed you the systems approach and the decision analysis approach, as you can see here, is features prominently as its own decision step. And it does so because you do have to worry about uncertainty. You do have to worry about the risks to your decision. You do have to worry about multi-criteria decision making. So it's important to talk about this step as well, and that's what we're doing in this section. The decision analysis step is different from evaluation step because, first of all, it attempts to boil down the trade-off and comparison found in evaluation to a single composite score. As I said, if there are trade-offs and comparisons, if there are multiple things to consider, then let's see how we can figure out one single composite score. And that's what happens in decision analysis. It tries to recognize the decision-making strategies and philosophies of the decision maker. And what we mean by philosophy is that what's their worldview, right? How do they value different things? How do we assign different weights to different criteria that we have gotten in our evaluation step? And the last thing is important too, is that at this stage, you're not just talking about analysts. You're not just talking about people who are doing the math, right? You're talking about the real decision makers. It could be politicians, it could be the bureaucrats, whoever. But now you're dealing with a little bit higher level in the organization, and you're considering all that. And there is still math involved. It's not like, you don't have to do any analysis here. So the analysts are still involved. It's just now it does have to directly involve the decision maker, the people who are going to sign off on projects. So one way of doing that, if you have multiple criteria, multiple quantitative measures that you've achieved, so one way of coming up is, or doing decision analysis, is coming up with simple composite scores. So what are these simple composite scores? Simple composite scores start with goal achievement matrix containing exclusively quantitative elements. And then you come up with an EIJ, is that normalized score for each alternative I with respect to quantitative criteria J. So basically you're normalizing it such that anytime a composite has a higher score, it's good. And then, and what we do is like, how do we normalize the score? Is that we normalize them between the same number, because as you might know, the benefit cost ratio might have a completely different scales on the project compared to the job losses, right? Or jobs gained, for example, right? So benefit cost ratio will be on a scale of like 1.2, 1.3, maybe 3, 4, 5, something like that. And then the jobs created for a project could be completely different range of numbers, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, depending upon the scale of the project. So just if you're taking those two sort of quantitative elements of decision making, maybe benefit cost ratio and jobs created, for example, because they will be on two different scales, we always want to make them into the same scale. Okay, and how we do that is that we always maybe boil them down between 0 and 1, right? So if you have minimum job losses, you classify them to be 0, and you have the alternative which has the maximum amount of minimum job creation, you quantify that at 0, and then maximum job creation becomes 1. Similarly, minimum benefit cost ratio becomes 0, and maximum cost benefit ratio becomes 1. So we normalize it in some way such that maxima and minima for each criteria are each of these elements is the same. Okay. So if there are criteria J and J prime, criteria, what I'm talking about criteria. So let me type this up just to make sure that we understand. So in terms of criteria, what are we talking about? It could be jobs gained, and it could be jobs gained. It could be B by C ratio. And then I would be alternatives. So I's represent alternative. So it could be alternative 1 versus alternative 2. Alternative would be like what projects you might do. And then, so criteria are jobs gained and B by C ratio, and there could be many more. That moose habitat loss, right? We saw that in the beginning of the lectures, beginning of this class. So it could be many different criteria, but they will always be in different scales. And I represents alternative I. So alternative 1, 2, 3, 4. We just have to normalize each criteria such that maximum and minimum values for those normalized score are the same. So normalize, and we'll see an example of that. And then define a weight uj to quantify the relative utility of each performance criteria. So this is where decision makers' values come into play. Like, do you want to make a decision based on benefit cost ratio, or you want to make a decision based on jobs gained, or do you want to make it 50-50, or like 90-10, 70-30, whatever is your relative weight that you want to assign, you can assign to each of those. And this is where the decision maker will have to tell you what weight they want to assign to each of those criteria. And then we come up with the composite score, which is just simply multiplying the normalized score with the utility that you just defined for that. And then you come up with a summation, and then you come up with a composite score. And then whichever alternative has the highest composite score will win. And then you will choose that alternative. Yeah? We'll try to look at an example of this. Okay? Okay, so constant criteria weight are often used in practice due to simplicity and transparency. So it's easy to convey to somebody that we are assigning 70% ratio to benefit cost ratio, 30% ratio to 30% ratio to jobs gained, for example, right? But that may not always be the case. Like what it assumes, if you assign a constant weight, that means you're assuming that you have a similar utility ratio. So you're assuming that the utilities are distributed in a straight line. Okay, so slope of this line is constant, and that's why you could use a constant ratio between the two different normalized scores. The weight that you assign to do those two different criteria could remain the same if you're assuming a constant criteria weight. But reality is that criteria weight might not be constant. They might look like this. Those criteria weight might change, something like this. And what's the point of this? Why is this? Why is this a problem? That means you are assuming, so if you're assuming this type of criteria weight, let me do a laser pointer. So you're assuming this type of, if actual criteria weight looks like this, when you're assuming this, what that means is that at certain levels, you assign very high weight to the job losses or job gain, for example, jobs gain, right? So your initial jobs gain, when you're gaining very few jobs, then at that point, the weight assigned to the jobs might be really high. Or on the other side, on the flip side, if your benefit cost ratio exceeds like, let's say 2.0, then maybe you don't care about benefit cost ratio as much. You want it to be about 2.0, but once you hit that criteria, then your focus becomes, hey, my benefit cost is above 2. Now all I care about is jobs. So any projects that meet that criteria, I'm just going to compare them 100% on job losses. Obviously, that's not a constant criteria weight. You want your benefit cost ratio to be at least 2.0, and then you base all your decision based on job losses. And this kind of becomes a little bit harder to convey. It's not as transparent than coming up with certain criteria weight and just kind of using that as a numbers game. In reality, if you're using these variable criteria weight, explaining that and being transparent about it and making sure that people are trusting you, that you're not just trying to game the system to come up or to arrive at your pre-preferred alternatives, or that alternative that you have prejudice for. So sometimes that could be a challenge. If you use variable criteria weight, that could be a big challenge, to make sure that people realize and recognize that you are not just trying to game the system to arrive at your preconceived alternatives that you preferred anyway. Okay, so, and then there is another challenge, is that assuming everything is known and no uncertainties are involved, and you could perform some kind of a sensitivity analysis if you don't know that, so you can run that same analysis at different assumptions. But again, that's another challenge with the constant weight question or constant weight approach. And then there are elaborate methods to arrive at the criteria weight. You can use the Delphi method. I briefly mentioned that or described that at the very beginning of our class when we discussed, how you bring in a panel of experts and then you have them look at a problem and try to reach consensus after knowing each other's opinion. And you could do that the same thing for arriving at the criteria weights too. Okay, you could do the same thing for arriving at the criteria weights. So let's go to the next slide. So Delphi method, as I said before, it's an expert method or 2 or more rounds. Starting from the second round, if feedback is given about the results of the previous round, the same set of experts, they assess the same matter once more now, but now they're influenced by the opinions of other experts. And that way you try to reach consensus. So that's what the Delphi method is. The Delphi studies are always issues about which unsure, incomplete knowledge exists. So basically you can never be sure about the expertise. Delphi are the judgment processes with unsure aspects. The persons involved in Delphi studies only give estimations, and that's why they're prone to being influenced by other experts. And that's a good thing in this case. If you're willing to change your opinion, that's a good thing in this case. For the participation, experts are to be involved who, on the basis of their knowledge and experience, are able to assess in a competent way. And during the rounds, they have the opportunity to gather new information. And this is how, in a lot of ways, Delphi method is, where I've seen this in practice most closely, this Delphi method in action, is how they evaluate the proposals, the research proposals that get submitted to the National Science Foundation, the NSF. So the NSF funds research And when they're evaluating proposals, at least the process that I observed was sort of a Delphi method type approach, where as a panel member, I was given the proposals before the panel met, and then I had to come up with an independent rating. And then when we went to the NSF in Washington, DC in the room, we were all given how other experts rated all those same proposals. And then we looked at each other's opinion, how they were describing, and then we tried to arrive at the consensus, which one of these is the best proposals to fund. So that sort of is like how I've seen the Delphi method in action. And that's sort of something similar that happens in a lot of sort of proposal type for grant making processes. So how do we do non-constant criteria weight? One method to develop non-constant criteria weight is to incorporate non-linear indifference curves and non-quantitative performance criteria by McKee and Bishop. So here, it's kind of like an incremental analysis. We compare alternatives in pairs, and then the winner of each contest is then compared to a new alternative until there are no alternatives left standing. Okay, so let's look at that approach of how we perform the pairwise criteria. So you have two alternatives, A and B. It's very important for us to understand, because sometimes I've seen students get confused, and it might not seem that way right now to you because you've been just talking about it. But when you do the problems, sometimes I've seen folks get a little bit confused about alternatives and criteria. Okay? So alternatives would be whether you build bridge A or bridge B, or whether you improve the roadway network in location A versus you improve it at location B, if you had to pick one. Okay, so those are your alternatives. Now, procedure for comparing two alternatives is pick any two performance criteria, consider how the two alternatives compare to the two criteria, okay. So procedure for comparing two alternatives, A and B, that you pick any two performance criteria, okay? Consider how the two alternatives compare for the two criteria. And then, so this is what we're talking about, like where you have multiple performance criteria, okay? You have 4 or 5 different criteria. Okay, so you pick any two performance criteria. It's always easy for folks to compare two different criteria, okay? Two different criteria is easier. So let's say you had 5 different criteria with which you can pick from. It could be, as a jobs gain, benefit cost ratio, environmental habitat. Let's go with 3 for now. It's hard for us to rate 3 things in an order, but if we were to look at 2 things, the decision maker have an easier time coming up with relative rates between the 2, relative ranking of the 2 criteria versus the 3 criteria. Okay, so this is what this McKee and Bishop approach takes advantage of. So you pick any 2 performance criteria, consider how 2 alternatives compare for the 2 criteria, rate 1 for the more important of the 2 criteria. So you rate them 1, most important. So if you picking up 2, you say, okay, I'm going to assign a weight of 1 or 1.0 to the more important of the 2 criteria, and I'm going to assign something less than 1 to the less important. Okay. Then pair the winner of the comparison against the other criteria. So whichever them has the rate 1, then you compare to the next one. Okay, you compare it to the next one, and then assign 1.0 to the one that's most important to you. Okay, so you assign one of those criteria to be weight 1.0, and then you assign something lower than that value to the other one. That will give us a ranking or relative scaling of all of those different criteria. Okay, and then we'll also know which is the most important criteria for us, and then we can rescale all the criteria relative to that single dominant criteria. And then once you've done that, once you've gotten the scale, so this is sort of, remember, up until this point in the process, let me draw a line here. Up until this point in the process, we haven't discussed the alternatives at all. Okay, so we haven't talked about A or B alternatives at all. Okay, so the alternatives don't show up in this process at all. Is that clear? We are not making use of any alternatives here. And then we'll classify each criterion as to whether, among each criterion, which one works better, which of the two alternatives work better. And then we just sum the rescale rating for criteria where A beats B, and do the same for the ratings where B beats A. Okay, and you subtract the sums. If the difference is positive, then we prefer the alternative A, otherwise B is preferred to A. And then the magnitude, if it's close enough, then our preference level is not that high. But if our preference level is, if the difference is large, then we can be very confident that we prefer alternative A compared to alternative B. And then if there are more alternatives, like for example, A and C, then you pick up that alternative with the winner, and you pit that against the same relative criteria scale. Okay. Now this might read a very challenging way, but we can actually go through this in the class right now. I'm going to need your engagement here to follow up on this. So I'm going to go ahead and pause that recording for a second. Okay. So let's think about a light rail system where the agency that is concerned is considering two different alignments of station or two different routing strategies or track layout strategies or track layouts, two different track layouts they're considering. And each of those track layouts have different criteria. Can you give me four performance criteria for that? If you're trying to figure out where you're going to lay out the tracks for the light rail system, can you give me 4 performance criteria via chat? So please, if you're responding, please respond to the whole class so that everybody can see what criteria have already been assigned. So please respond in the chat to the whole class. And I'm looking for 4 different performance criteria from you guys. And then we'll try to rate them using the procedure that we have here. So based on our discussion in the chat, and then what I could come up with, we came up with number of passengers, noise pollution, costs, and the natural habitat loss. Okay. So these are the 4 criteria we came up with. And those are the 4 criteria. Let me pause the recording again. So the 4 criteria we came up with is the amount of passengers that live within 0.25 miles of each station with each of those layouts. So obviously we want more people to be served by the light rail. Then we came up with the noise pollution criteria, which layout would affect more people with noise pollution. Costs, like what's the construction and the whole costs of actually laying out the tracks. And then last one could be the natural habitat lost. Okay. So then if there is going to be any trees that would have to be cut down or any kind of natural habitat loss. So let's figure out any 2 of these passenger criteria. So let's pick out the number of passengers served and the noise pollution. So I'm picking out two of those criteria. And give me an idea. What's your idea? What should I rate? Which of those is more important between number of passengers served and noise pollution? Which one of those is more important to you? Which of those criteria is more important? The number of passengers served and the noise pollution. So I've been hearing from the class that the number of passengers is the more important criteria. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign that 1.0 weight, 1.0. So the weight that I'll rate that as 1. Now tell me, how much less would you weigh or would you assign the importance level to noise pollution compared to the number of passengers served? How much less important? And based on that, give me a relative number relative to 1.0 that you assign to the number of passengers served. Where would you put the noise pollution at? Oh, very, very precise, 0.68. Okay, I'm going to go with 0.68. That's fine. Typically that feels like false precision to me, because if you're talking about numbers that are in 2 decimal places, then that means that you're really looking at something very precise that you arrived at by some careful calculation. I'll probably call it 0.7, but let's go with 0.68. Okay. All right. So then I'm going to pick the winner of those criteria. And so winner of those 2 criteria is the number of passengers served. And now I'm going to compare it to the costs. Which one would you put? Where would you put? Which one is more important to you among number of passengers served and costs? If you were the decision maker, which one of the 2 is more important here? Number of passengers served or the construction costs? The overall cost of actually laying out the tracks. Which one do you think is more important? If they're close enough, then maybe you can assign one of them the winner to be 1.0, and then the second one could be something very close, like 0.9 or something. So that could be one approach you could take. Let's just come up with some numbers, please. And then, because my goal is not necessarily you're not running a transit agency, right? So you're just trying to give me an example so I can demonstrate this process for you. So which one do you think is more important, number of passengers served or the construction costs? Pause the recording for a second, looking for a response. Okay, so the answer I heard when I was doing the comparison, number of passengers served is more important than the cost, but they're sort of close to each other. So the relative weight that we assign to it is 1.0 to the passenger service or passenger served and 0.8 to the cost. And that makes sense to me. But my dominant criteria still remains number of passenger service. So I'm going to compare that to the last of my criteria, which is the natural habitat lost. Okay, natural habitat lost. So give me which one of these is among these 2 is more important to you, number of passengers served or natural habitat lost. So the suggestion that I heard is that between number of passengers served and the amount of natural habitat lost, it looks like the number of passengers served is still more important. And the relative ranking that we have for natural habitat loss is 0.88. Okay? So in this example, I think we made our task a little bit easier by assigning number of passengers to be the dominant criteria through and through. It literally won all the comparisons that we compare it to. If it didn't win one of those, then relative criteria would be a little bit more challenging to come up with that. But the rescaling in this case should be fairly easy, because now because you compared each of them to the same dominant criteria. So you can assign the 4 criteria these following weights: what you can do is you can assign 1.0, and then you can assign 0.88 to natural habitat. In this case, you can assign, and I can start typing it up in the slide here. Based on the discussion that we just had, I could say that my relative weight is 1.0 for the passenger served and 0.88 for habitat lost. And I could say costs will be 0.8 to 0.8 would be costs, and 0.68 would be noise pollution. Okay, so that's the relative criteria we came up with. Now, remember, we made our task a little bit easier by doing what? By always having one winner that we started off with, right? And that could make the process a little bit easier if you have an idea that, hey, if you already know which one is most important to you, comparing everything to that can give you that relative scale. So you could get that rescaling of all criteria became pretty easy for us now. Okay, because our single dominant criteria was there. Now, if that were not the case, then we might still have to come up with that. What's the most important winner? That will get assigned the weight 1. And then we'll have to rescale everything else relative to that new criteria, new victory criteria. Okay. But this is the relative weight. And then for each of these criteria, we can define which of these alternative wins. And I'm going to just randomly assign that in passenger served, A is the winner, B, and A. Okay, let's see. Oh my goodness, you guys have left me in a very bad situation. I'm gonna make this, because that'll lead to a tie for me. So I'm gonna make it. So let's assume that the noise pollution was 69, or maybe let's make it 0.70. Okay, and then let's make it. Maybe it was fine. I don't. What did we have before? 0.88. And then we had 0. Yeah, so let's make it 70 for the noise pollution. Okay, so I'm just going to make it. So let's say these were our winner. For passenger served, A was the winner. For habitat loss, B was the winner. For cost, B was the winner. And for noise pollution, A is the winner. So that's the project, or that's the alternative that wins on each of those criteria. So then we'll sum the rescaled ratings for criteria where A beats B. So when we sum it up, where A beats B, it's 1.70. So where A beats B or B beats A, so where A beats B, the sum is 1.70. Where B beats A, the sum is 0.70 plus 0.80 plus 0.88. That gives me 1.68. Okay, so again, you can see the numbers are really close here, right? 1.70 and 1.68. And you subtract the sum, and I subtract the sum, I get equal to 0.02. Ooh, it's positive. Okay, if it's positive, because where A beats B and I came out to be positive, then I prefer alternative A compared to alternative B. Okay, but look at it carefully. The difference is very small between the two alternatives. So that shows me that, yeah, I'll mildly prefer alternative A, but maybe not by that much. Okay, so that's how you replicate this process to figure out which alternative is preferred. Okay, now if you had more alternatives, you'll replicate that process with alternative A, which is the winner of this round, with alternative C that you have a third one. Okay, and you keep going until you've exhausted all the alternatives. Okay, so I hope I was able to demonstrate this process via a little interactivity to you. That makes sense? Any questions about this process? I'll go ahead and pause recording for you. Okay, so let's look at the next slide then. And then there are the decision-making strategies. So now we are talking about, let's say we can estimate the composite scores for our alternatives. So we are assuming that's what we can do. But now we have to do decision making, DM, decision making, under uncertainty, where all weights and scores are known. And then we call, so first situation is decision making under complete certainty. So then you know all the scores and weights, and then you just use those to make your decision. But then we could also talk about decision making under risk, where scores and weights follow estimable probability distributions. And then decision making under uncertainty, where parameters vary and at least some of the things are completely unknowable. Now, the risk and uncertainty scores can apply to the effectiveness scores, and then they can also apply to the criteria weights. So the uncertainty could be anywhere, not just in the score that you have for each alternative, but it could also be that your weights are uncertain because you don't know what situation you're going to encounter, and your weights are going to be dependent on that. So let's say you have the composite score for each of the alternatives, and this is the probability distribution looks like. Okay, so alternative 1, alternative 2, and alternative 3, you have the composite score that you came up with. And for all those alternatives, instead of having one composite score, you have these probability distributions. And if you know anything about the probability distribution, you can figure out the area under the curve. You can figure out the area under the curve. So for example, if I want to find the probability of this distribution being between 7 and 8, I can find out this area under this curve. And this area under the curve will give me what is the probability of the utility score for alternative 1 to lie between 7 and 8. Okay? So that's what these probability distribution are telling me. And for this one, the area would be, if I want to figure out what's the probability of the utility score for alternative 3 lying between 7 and 8, I'll find out the newly shaded area. Okay, so that's how you figure out this thing, the probability. That's how you use the probability distributions to figure out what is the probability of alternatives having that utility score or that range of utility score. Okay. So you could have some aspiration level criterion. Reject any criteria not meeting a stated minimum threshold. Okay, so let's look at this. And I'll make this bigger as well so you can see both slides. Yeah. Okay. So do you guys, so I want to show you, so I want to talk about the aspiration level criteria. Reject any alternative not meeting a minimum threshold. So go ahead and annotate this. So this is what I'm trying to figure out. Aspiration level criteria. And let's say if somebody told you that you must meet any alternative that has its utility falling below 2.0 is not acceptable. There's like if your decision maker says that you must have the utility of the alternative to be exceeding 2.0, then which of these criteria can you drop? Which of these criteria would you drop if you must have a utility level of 2.0 or above? Okay, I'm going to pause recording. I'm looking for an answer. So the reason you will discard alternative 2 if you must have the utility score of more than 2, because if you look at this chart right here, alternative 3 has this probability here. This area under the curve is the probability. So I'm just looking at eyeballing this curve. It looks like at least there is 10 to 15% chance, because the area will be, the whole area under the curve will be 1.0. And then the area on that left side of the line, red line, would be about 15%. So there is a 15% chance that your utility score could fall below 2.0. And you never want to have that happen. So then you will discard alternative 2 here, alternative 3 here. I'm sorry. Okay. Then you could have an expected value criterion. You could decide your alternative based on the alternative with the highest expected value. So if you look at the expected value is typically the average. So if you look at the expected value for each of these alternatives, and let me do it in a different color here. So the expected value for alternative 1 would be somewhere here. So kind of in the middle of the distribution. For this one, it will be 7. And for this one, it will be around 5. So the expected value is sort of the average of the distribution, lies in sort of the middle of that. Okay. So expected value criteria will give me 7.5, 7, and 5. And because alternative 1 has that highest value, I'll probably pick alternative 1 in that scenario if I'm picking based on the alternative or expected value criteria. Okay. Okay, now let's look at some percentile criteria here. Percentile criteria says, select the alternative that is percentile likely to exceed a given threshold. Okay. Okay. If you're basically basing it on 90% criteria, okay, which is the 90% certain, which of these, okay, so the question is, select alternatives. The question is, select alternatives that is percentile likely to exceed a given threshold. Okay. Which of these alternatives is 90% certain to have a composite score of more than 5.5? Let's see. Let's go back to my slide here. Which of these alternative is 90% certain to have a composite score of more than 5.5? So again, you will try to draw a line at 5.5. So you draw a line at 5.5. And then you look at the area that's to the left of that line. Yeah, thank you. I see a couple of responses. Alternative 2, that's exactly right. Because you could see that this is probably has like about 20% of its area to the left. This has almost 60%. Alternative 3 has 60% area to the left. But if you look at this one, that probably has almost even more than 90% area to the left of 5.5. Or I'm sorry, less than 10% of its area to the left of 5.5. So I'll pick alternative 2 in that scenario. Okay. Then there are other types of criteria like maxi-min criteria. You choose alternative that maximizes the minimum payoff possible. Maximizes the minimum payoff possible. Okay. Which one has the highest amount for the minimum payoff? So what's the minimum payoff for alternative 1? I'm looking for the minimum payoff for alternative 1. So minimum is wherever these distributions actually start. So the minimum payoff for this one right here The minimum payoff for this one is about 5.2. And then the minimum payoff for this one is basically where the distribution starts, almost 0. So if you want to maximize that minimum payoff, which alternative would you pick? You should know that. Which alternative would you pick if you're trying to maximize the minimum possible payoff? Okay, so I see number 2. Yeah, that's exactly right. You will see the number 2 is the maximizes the minimum possible payoff. And then there is a criteria called maximax. Okay, maximax is maximize the maximum possible payoff. Okay, so then you draw the line at the maximum payoff. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Take maximum possible payoff. I'm going to draw a line there. Like that. Maybe alternative 3 is exactly right. Yeah, that because that has the maximum value that goes out. So maximum possible payoff is the C. And then the last one is the Hurwitz rule. Hurwitz rule is choose based on average of the best and worst outcome. And you sort of do a weighted average of alpha and 1 minus alpha. So you have a Hurwitz alpha value of 0.2. So then you assign 0.2 to the best possible case for that scenario, and 0.8, 1 minus alpha, to the worst possible outcome for that scenario. And then you come up with like a sort of a weighted average for that two. And then you say whichever one maximizes it, you go with that. Okay, so we'll do an example problem of this. So we are clear about this, and there will be a problem relevant to this in the test as well. Okay, so we'll do an example of this Hurwitz rule and all these other strategies, as I mentioned. Okay, so we'll do an example of this right here at the end of the lecture. So we should get some practice of that. But there is another approach, which is the Monte Carlo simulation approach, which is your last lab is about, that we're going to do during that week. It basically uses simulation based on random numbers to develop probability distribution and come up with composite scores that way. And then probability based decision strategies can be very powerful if you can trust the numbers. Okay, so that's something that you have to look at. And then there is one more scenario that's called most probable future. It's a variation on the expected value, but it requires calculation of composite scores for alternatives under different scenarios with known probabilities. And the example problem that we're going to do is, let's say we are trying to improve the roadway California 299. Okay, and then there are three scenarios. First scenario is that an alternative route US 101 is also improved. Second scenario is that 101 is not improved and you have a poor economy. And then the third scenario is Highway 101 is not improved, but your economy is good. Okay, and then for each of these scenarios, we assume that you know the payoff matrix. Okay, for each of these scenarios, you know the payoff values for each of those scenarios. So you've come up with all your composite score, you've combined multiple criteria, but now you're settled into these different payoff matrices. Okay, so alternatives are along the rows A, B, C, and D, and three columns are scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Okay, remember, alternatives is what you can pick. Scenarios are something that happen. So scenarios have the probability, not alternatives. So scenarios have a probability assigned to them. And scenario probabilities in this case is for scenario 1, where US 101 is improved, is 0.3. Probability for scenario 2 is 0.2, where you have US 101 improved and poor economy. And then scenario 3 is where US 101 is improved and you have good economy is 0.5. Okay, so if you add up all the probabilities, they obviously add up to 1.0, which is nice. And then you're given payoff values for each of these alternatives. And we are trying to figure out how do you pick alternatives. And let's see if I want to pick my alternative based on the most probable scenario. Most probable scenario. Okay. So I'm going to say, okay, I don't know which scenario will happen, but let's see, the scenario that's the most likely scenario among these three. Which is the most likely scenario? 1, 2, or 3? Which is the most likely scenario between 1, 2, and 3? You should know this. Yeah. So I see something in the chat. Yep. Scenario C. Scenario third. I'm sorry, not scenario C. My apology. Scenario third scenario. Third scenario is exactly right because it has the probability of 0.5, right? Highest probability. So if I assume that my most probable scenario is what's going to happen, which one would you pick? Which alternative would you pick? Which alternative has the max payoff in scenario 3? It's this one, right? So I'm going to pick alternative D. Why? Because it has the most payoff, because these numbers are payoff. They represent the payoff of a particular project. If scenario 3 happens, I'm better off picking alternative D because that has the most payoff under that scenario. Now, expected value. This is an interesting one because it requires some calculations, but calculations are fairly simple. For each alternative, you take their payoff and weight them, and you apply the weights according to the scenario probability. So I'm going to show you how we come up with 5.2. So I'm going to go and text how do we come up with 5.2? It's nothing but 10 multiplied the probability of that scenario, 0.3, plus 6 multiplied by the probability of the second scenario, 0.2, plus 2 multiplied by the probability of that scenario. So for alternative A, if I'm trying to come up with the expected value criteria, it will be this one. 10.3 is 3, 1.2, and 1. So that leads me, if I add that up, I get 5.2. So according to expected value criteria, alternative A's composite payoff is 5.2. Can you take 1 minute to make sure that you can get you can obtain the expected value for criteria B? It's basically the payoff times the probability of that scenario occurring. How would you, so take 1 minute to come up with the payoff for scenario number 2. Or sorry, alternative B. I'm sorry. Come up with a payoff for alternative B. See, that's how the confusion happens. I was mentioning that it's easy to confuse between scenarios and alternatives. So just make sure that you understand alternatives is what you are picking from. Scenarios is what you know the probabilities for. So now I want you to come up with the expected value or expected value of payoff for alternative B given these probabilities. You should be able to do that. Yeah, I'm going to pause the recording for a second. So this is how we'll do it. 8 times 0.3, 4 times 0.2, 6 times 0.5. Those are your numbers here. And then you get the 6.2. So your expected value of payoff for alternative B would be 6.2. You can do the same calculation for C and D. The answer will be 5.6 and 5.1. Which one would you pick? That's easy. Pick B because that has the highest expected value of the payoff. Okay. Laplace rule is interesting because it's just same as expected value criteria, but we assume that all scenario probabilities are the same. We assume, so in that case, you're just summing up the payoff for 3 scenarios, really. Because if you're assuming 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 probability, you're essentially just picking the highest number based off of that, and it's easy to come up with that number. So in this case, you will sum up, we will find whichever one gives you the most value when you add these three numbers up. So 10 plus 6 plus 2 is 18. 8 plus 4 plus 6 is also 18. 6 plus 9 plus 4 is 19. 4 plus 2 plus 7 is 13. So you'll pick alternative C because that gives you the most payoff. Obviously, it's going to be divided by 1/3 because you have to multiply by the probability, but highest number would still be the same for alternative C. So that will be your expected payoff under the Laplace rule. Because in Laplace rule, we assume that all these probabilities are 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for the scenario. I mean, if there are 4 scenarios, then it will be 0.25, but just equal probability of each scenario occurring. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. What's going on here? Now, one thing that's interesting also, we have only a few minutes left, so I'll try to wrap up quickly. But you can derive from the payoff matrix, you can derive what we call the regret matrix. And all the criteria that we talked about, they can also be applied to the regret. The regret matrix is defined based on if you select alternative I, but scenario J happens. Okay. If you select alternative I and scenario J happens, what is your regret in that scenario? Okay. So let's try to see if we can come up with our own regret matrix for A, B, C, and D. And then I'm going to try to annotate it with the chart here. So let's say you picked alternative A. Let's say you picked alternative A and scenario 1 happened. What's going to be your regret? What's going to be your regret if scenario, did you lose any payoff if scenario 1 happened? Scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3. If scenario 1 happened and you picked alternative A, would you regret that choice first of all? Would you regret that choice? I would not regret that choice because under scenario 1, actually alternative A gives me most payoff. So no regrets, obviously no regrets because I got the most payoff that I could have gotten because under scenario 1, my max payoff is 10. So no regrets at all. But if you picked alternative B, what's your regret? You could have gotten a payoff of 10, but you only got the payoff of 8. So my regret amount will be 2. If I picked alternative C, my regret would be even higher because I could have picked alternative A and made a payoff of 10 units, but I only made a payoff of 6 units. So my regret matrix will have 4 in there. And then for alternative D, it will be 6. So you basically subtract the payoff of the best possible alternative under that scenario. Okay. So let's think about this for alternative 2. If scenario, what's the best possible scenario where we won't have any regret? If scenario 2 panned out, which alternative would give you no regrets? If scenario 2 happened, which alternative will give you no regrets? That's right. Alternative C will give me no regret because that gives me the most payoff. So my regret, if I chose alternative C, would be 0. But now based on that, I can define what would have been my regret if I picked alternative A in scenario 2. You should know this, right? I see something in the chat. That's exactly right. 3 is right. That's correct. What's going to be my regret if I picked alternative B? 5, right? And then if I picked 2, oh my, it will be a regret of 7. Same thing I could do for 3. If I picked, scenario 3 happened, and I picked alternative A, what is my regret in that scenario? What is my regret in that scenario? My regret is 5. That's correct. Because If I picked alternatives D, I would not have any regret because I would be making the most payoff of that scenario. But if I picked C, I'll have a regret of 3. I'll have a regret of 1. So now I came up with a regret matrix, and you could see that regret matrix in the next slide as well. And that's the regret matrix I came up with: 035, 251, 403, and 670. Okay, we came up with the same regret matrix on the other slide. So that's how you derive the regret matrix. And then you can do the same thing, minimax criteria, minimax regret criteria. Okay, so minimax means minimize the maximum regret. So if you're trying to minimize the maximum regret, which alternative would you pick? So this is for A, B, C, and D. So just to make sure that we got it. A, B, C, and D. So can you tell me if you want to minimize the maximum possible regret, which alternative would you pick? So then you start looking at which alternative maximum possible regret is the lowest. What's the maximum possible regret for alternative A? What is the maximum possible regret for alternative A? What is the maximum possible regret that you could have if you picked alternative A? The max possible regret is 5. That's right. What is the max possible regret for alternative B? That's also 5. For C, it is only 4 because the maximum regret that you could have is 4. And for D, max possible regret is 7. So I'll pick C. Okay. Now, if you add an alternative, all these values might change. So you have to kind of do this analysis carefully. And then you can also do max min. Maximize the minimum regret also, right? So you could do it that way as well. And you could identify those criteria as well. Okay. So you will have a homework problem related to this. So you'll get some practice based on this. So make sure that you watch this lecture. And with that, I would like to conclude. This is great timing. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving break. I will most likely be working Monday, Tuesday. I won't have office hours on the coming Tuesday because the school is off. But I am, in fact, working those days because I have a bunch of things going on. So if you have questions, if you want to talk to me, set up an appointment with Calendly, as I said in the syllabus. So let's do that on Monday and Tuesday. So I'll be bailing out like Wednesday afternoon from work. So please try to schedule anything if you want. If you have questions, please try to schedule something by Monday or Tuesday. But I'll still be available via Calendly, so this should work. Okay. Again, if I don't see you before then, have a great break, and I will see you guys on the other side of the break. Okay. Thank you. Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Brian, did you have a question?